My mother convinced my fiancé to marry my sister, saying, "She'll give you the life my daughter never could." I disappeared without a word. Years later, we met again. At a lavish gala I hosted, and when they saw who my husband was, their smiles vanished because my husband was. The first thing I noticed about Claire that night was that she wasn't wearing my grandmother's pearls anymore. 6 years, and I still cataloged her like an inventory. Old habit. The kind you don't unlearn just because you moved 1,400 miles away and changed your last name and built an entire second life out of spite and spreadsheets. She stood in the doorway of my ballroom in a dress that cost more than my first apartment's monthly rent, laughing at something my mother had said, one hand resting on my ex-fiancé's forearm like she'd trademarked the gesture. Ryan Hawthorne, still handsome in the loose, unfinished way he'd always been handsome, like a house with good bones and no interior walls. He didn't recognize the room he was standing in belonged to me. Not yet. I want to tell you I felt nothing when I saw them. That 6 years of forensic-grade discipline had scoured every last drop of feeling out of me the way I'd scoured every last dollar of fraud out of 3 different companies since. But that would be a lie. And I promised myself a long time ago I was done lying, even to make myself sound stronger than I was. What I felt was my pulse in my ears. What I felt was the box of wedding invitations I'd been holding 6 years earlier. The weight of it. The way the cardboard corner had dug into my hip while my mother told the man I loved that my sister would give him a life I never could, right in front of me, like I was furniture that had learned to stand upright. I set my champagne flute down on a passing tray and smoothed the front of my dress, not the wedding dress that still hung, as far as I know, in a garment bag in my mother's closet, but a deep emerald gown my husband had picked out because he said it matched the color you get in your eyes right before you win an argument. $12 million in pledges were on the line tonight. 3 business magazines had reporters in this room, and the 2 people who'd once decided I was disposable were about to find out exactly what they'd thrown away. I didn't make a scene when my mother handed my fiancé to my sister like a dinner plate. I was done not making scenes. I'd spent 5 years being told I was practically his wife already, which is a special kind of insult dressed up as a compliment. It means you do all the labor of the role with none of the protections of the title. I covered Ryan's payroll twice out of my personal savings when Hawthorne Consulting was 3 weeks from missing its first big contract. I sat up until 2 in the morning proofreading his investor deck. I introduced him to half the people who eventually funded that firm, at parties I'd been invited to, and he hadn't. None of that mattered on the morning I walked into my mother's living room, holding a box of invitations we were supposed to mail before 10 a.m. My mother, Patricia Calloway, has a particular voice she uses for pronouncements. Flat, pleasant, unassailable, like she's reading out a weather forecast instead of detonating someone's life. "Claire will give you the life Emily never could," she told him. She didn't whisper it. She didn't pull him aside. She said it standing in her own doorway in full daylight, with me 12 feet away holding $400 of stationery. Ryan didn't flinch. That's the detail that took me the longest to stop replaying. Not the words. Words from my mother had never surprised me. Not really. Not if I was honest about the small, accumulated cruelties of 30 years. It was that Ryan received the sentence the way you'd receive a weather forecast yourself. A nod, an acceptance, like she'd told him something reasonable, obvious, overdue. Claire walked in from the kitchen wearing my grandmother's pearl earrings. She'd taken them off my dresser 2 days earlier, told me she just wanted to try them on, and I'd said fine because saying no to Claire had never once in my life produced a result that didn't cost me more than the yes would have. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Ryan said, which is the sentence men say when they mean "I let this happen," and I'd like partial credit for feeling bad about it. I laughed. One short, ugly sound. More air than voice. 5 years of building his business. 5 years of my name never once appearing on a single filing, a single deed, a single asset, because he'd said it was cleaner that way, and I'd let it be clean because I trusted him with the kind of trust you only get to spend once. And this was the payoff. My mother's living room. A pair of stolen earrings. A man who couldn't manage a flinch. "Don't make a scene, Emily," my mother said, arms crossed. "Be gracious." I didn't make a scene. I made a decision, and I made it in about the time it takes a kettle to stop screaming. That night I packed 1 suitcase, not 2, not 4, 1, because I'd learned by then that the things worth keeping rarely take up much space. I withdrew what remained in my personal account, $11,200, money I'd been quietly setting aside since the second time I'd covered Ryan's payroll, and some small, cold part of me had started keeping receipts on my own life. I bought a one-way ticket to Denver. I changed my number somewhere over Kansas before the plane had even finished its descent, so that by the time the wheels touched down there was no line back to me. No forwarding address, no goodbye. Goodbyes are for people who deserve one. For 6 years they heard nothing. They didn't know I'd taken a junior analyst position at a scrappy nonprofit software company nobody outside a few conference rooms had ever heard of. A company trying badly to modernize how mid-sized charities tracked donor funds. They didn't know I rebuilt its entire donor platform from the studs up, working nights, sleeping in 4-hour increments, eating cold Thai food out of the container at my desk because a hot meal felt like a luxury I hadn't earned yet. They didn't know that company became a national fundraising infrastructure platform used by 900 nonprofits in 31 states, or that I became its chief strategy officer at 34. And they had absolutely no idea that the black tie gala they were about to walk into, the one 3 business magazines had assigned reporters to, the one built around a $12 million fundraising target for rural healthcare access, belonged to me. That I had approved the seating chart, that I had personally signed off on the caterer, the string quartet, and as it happened, the guest list of the acquisition group evaluating a mid-sized consulting firm called Hawthorne Hawthorne Advisory for purchase. I saw them the second they came through the door. My mother in pearls of her own now, not my grandmother's, but a passable knockoff, and something in me noted that too, filed it away the way I file everything. Claire, glittering, laughing at nothing in particular the way people do when they want a room to notice how at ease they are. And Ryan, trailing a half step behind both of them in a suit that fit too tight across the shoulders, like he'd put on weight trying to look like a man who'd made it. He was here because his firm was being acquired. He'd spent 6 months, I'd later learn, groveling to impress the investment group circling Hawthorne Advisory, convinced this sale was the only thing standing between him and a debt that had been quietly swallowing the company whole for over a year. He had no idea who signed the checks that made this night possible. Emily, he said when he spotted me, all teeth, the same practiced warmth he'd once used on investors twice his age. You look, wow, it's been years. Claire's hand found his forearm again, that small proprietary gesture, though I noticed, because I notice everything now, it's practically an occupational hazard, that my pearl earrings were nowhere on her. Sold, probably, or simply lost, the way anything precious eventually becomes disposable to people who never had to earn it in the first place. My mother stepped forward first, that same tight, weather forecast smile arranging itself across her face. Darling, we always hoped you were doing well. Welcome to my event, I said. I watched the word my land on Ryan's face like a stone dropped in still water. The ripple took a second to reach the surface, but I saw it arrive. The small recalibration behind his eyes as he tried to fit this ballroom, this quartet, this room full of people whose names appeared in the magazines that covered his industry, into whatever small, manageable box he'd kept me filed under for 6 years. Before he could finish the math, a man in a charcoal suit crossed the marble floor toward us, a leather folder tucked under one arm. He nodded once at the woman standing beside me, the same woman Ryan had spent the last 20 minutes trying to identify as someone worth impressing, without quite placing why she looked so familiar. Mr. Hawthorne, the man said, the Carter file is ready. We found some things before closing. Ryan's face went the particular shade of white that has nothing to do with lighting, because the man he'd spent 6 months trying to impress, the one whose signature, in a matter of days, would decide whether Hawthorne Advisory survived its own acquisition, was my husband. And my husband was already opening that folder just wide enough to catch the chandelier light on the first page, holding it toward my mother like he wanted her, specifically to see it. Emily, he said, since you're leading the ethics review tonight, Ryan lunged for the folder. Wait, let's talk about this privately. I looked at the man who had let my mother trade me away 6 years earlier like a coupon nobody wanted to redeem. No, I said, but you can watch. I should back up, because none of this makes sense without the 6 years in between. The part where a person becomes someone capable of standing in a ballroom and saying no, but you can watch without her voice shaking. The junior analyst job at Meridian Cause Platforms almost didn't happen. I'd applied under my mother's maiden name, Voss, half out of superstition and half because some animal part of me understood that Callaway carried weight I didn't want following me to Denver. Emily Voss got the interview. Emily Voss got the offer. Emily Voss spent her first 6 months reconciling donor ledgers that hadn't been touched in 3 years, finding transposed digits and phantom refunds, and one particularly egregious case where a departed employee had been quietly routing small processing fees into a personal account for 18 months before anyone noticed. I noticed. It took me 4 days of after-hours work, unpaid, because I couldn't stop pulling the thread once I'd started. That's when I met Priya Anand, Meridian's outside forensic accountant, brought in on retainer after the fraud came to light. Priya had spent 14 years reconstructing financial trails for nonprofits, insurance companies, and, on 2 memorable occasions, federal prosecutors. She looked at my reconciliation work, unsolicited, unpaid, done at 2 in the morning on top of my actual job, and asked who'd trained me. Nobody, I told her. I just don't like when numbers lie. She hired me, essentially, on the spot, not away from Meridian, but into a standing consulting relationship that ran alongside my day job for the next year and a half. Priya taught me to read a general ledger the way some people read faces. She taught me the specific, unglamorous vocabulary of financial deception, shell vendors, round-tripping, structuring, the particular cadence of a fraudster who's good enough to hide the theft, but not quite good enough to hide the anxiety underneath it. By the time Meridian's board asked me to help rebuild the donor platform from scratch, because the fraud had exposed just how brittle the existing system was, I already understood something most software architects didn't. The platform wasn't really about donations, it was about trust, made auditable. Every dollar needed a paper trail a stranger could follow without needing to trust anyone's word for it. I built it that way. I built it so that a 14-year-old girl in rural Kentucky whose family needed a fundraiser for a wheelchair ramp could see in real time exactly where every dollar of her campaign went. I built it, if I'm honest with the parts of myself that don't get to speak much anymore, as the opposite of every unaudited, unaccounted for year I'd spent trusting Ryan with money that never once had my name attached to it. Meridian went from 40 employees to 405 years. I went from junior analyst to chief strategy officer, and somewhere in the middle of that climb, at a fundraising summit in Chicago, I met Daniel Reyes. Daniel ran the private equity arm, quietly backing 3 of Meridian's largest institutional partners. He had a habit of asking the second question, not how's the platform doing, but what's the thing about the platform you haven't told anyone yet, the thing that actually worries you. Nobody had asked me that question in years. I answered it for 45 minutes over a hotel bar's terrible coffee, and by the end of it, he'd offered no investment, no pitch, nothing transactional at all, just his card and a line I still think about. Most people build things to be seen. You built something so nobody would have have to trust you blindly. That's rarer than it sounds. We were married 11 months later in a courthouse with 2 witnesses and no garment bag hanging anywhere. Daniel didn't just run investments. He ran ethics reviews, a small, specialized due diligence practice inside his firm that got called in whenever an acquisition target's financials smelled slightly off before a deal closed. It was tedious, unglamorous work most people in private equity considered beneath them. I loved him for finding it worth doing. I didn't know, when Meridian agreed to co-host tonight's healthcare access gala with Daniel's firm, that Hawthorne Advisory would be on the acquisition group's shortlist. I didn't know until 3 weeks before the event, reading a target company packet Daniel had left open on the kitchen table, that the firm's name attached to the deal was Ryan's. I read the whole file that night, every page. And on page 14, in a section labeled Related Party Transactions, Preliminary Flag, I found the first thread that would unravel everything else. A consulting entity called Carter Family Consulting, receiving disbursements from Hawthorne Advisory's operating account at a frequency and pattern that looked less like a vendor relationship and more like a drain. Carter. My mother's maiden name was Voss. My sister's married name, as of 4 years ago, was Carter. Claire had married and divorced a man named Peter Carter in the space of 14 months, and kept the surname because, as she'd told a mutual acquaintance at the time, it sounds more sophisticated than Calloway. I didn't say anything to Daniel that night. I just asked him, carefully, generally, whether the ethics review team had authority to dig deeper into a related party flag before closing. Always, he said. That's the whole point of flagging it. The escalation loop started the way they always do. Quietly, and then not quietly at all. Loop 1. Priya, whom I'd brought in as an outside forensic consultant on the Hawthorne file specifically because I trusted no one else to be that thorough, pulled 18 months of Hawthorne Advisory's disbursement records. Carter Family Consulting had received 41 payments in that window, averaging $6,200 each, always processed the week after payroll cleared, always coded internally as strategic advisory services. I told myself it could be legitimate. Consulting firms hire consultants. It happens. Loop 2. Priya couldn't find a single deliverable attached to any of the 41 payments. No invoice detail, no scope of work, no engagement letter on file. Companies that pay $6,000 a month for nothing usually aren't paying for nothing, she told me over the phone, in the particular dry register she uses when she already knows the answer and is waiting for me to catch up. My hands were steady when I hung up. They weren't steady 20 minutes later, alone in my office, staring at Claire's name on the entity's registration filing. Loop 3. I asked Daniel, hypothetically, what happens when a flagged related party turns out to be a family member of the review lead? You recuse, he said immediately. No exceptions. You hand it to someone else and you stay out of the room. I told him I understood. I did not, at that point, tell him why I was asking. I told myself I was protecting the review's integrity. I told myself that for exactly 1 day. Loop 4. I drove to a coffee shop 2 towns over from Daniel's office, ostensibly to clear my head, and called the Colorado Secretary of State's business registry line instead. Carter Family Consulting's registered agent was Claire Carter. Its listed business address was an apartment complex in Aurora I recognized from an old holiday card. My stomach dropped in the specific physical way Priya had taught me to trust more than any statement of feeling, because the body knows before the mind admits it. I sat in that parking lot for 11 minutes before I could drive. Loop 5. I tried one final time to talk myself out of what I already knew. Maybe Claire genuinely provided strategic advisory services. Maybe Ryan had simply overpaid a family connection out of old sentiment, the way people sometimes do. I ran the possibility past Priya without naming anyone, the way you test a wound to see if it's really as bad as it feels. She listened, and then she asked one question that ended the exercise. Has this consultant ever, at any point, worked in strategy, finance, or advisory services professionally? Claire had been a part-time esthetician for 6 years, and before that, briefly, a receptionist. I stopped rationalizing after that. There wasn't anything left to rationalize. I recused myself from the Hawthorne file the following Monday, exactly the way Daniel had told me to, formally, in writing, citing a personal connection to a related party. I did not specify which party, and Daniel, professional to his bones, did not ask. What I did instead was give Priya everything I'd found and let the actual sanctioned investigation happen without me in the room. That distinction mattered more than almost anything else in this whole story. The difference between exposing something because it's true and exposing something because I wanted to watch it burn. I wanted the second thing badly. I made myself settle for the first. Priya brought in Marcus Webb, a licensed forensic document examiner with 22 years of experience authenticating financial records for litigation, to independently verify the Carter Family Consulting paper trail before anyone made it official. Marcus's specialty was catching exactly the kind of thing amateurs think they've hidden well. Backdated engagement letters, inconsistent font kerning on supposedly contemporaneous invoices, metadata timestamps that didn't match the dates typed onto the documents themselves. He found 4 invoices, allegedly issued over an 8-month span, that had all been created in the same 48-hour window 3 weeks before the acquisition group's due diligence deadline. Someone, and Marcus's report was careful, appropriately careful, to say someone with access to Hawthorne Advisory's shared drive, rather than naming a name he couldn't yet prove, had manufactured a paper trail retroactively, trying to make 41 months of unexplained payments look like a documented consulting relationship after the fact. Daniel brought in one more name at that point, Detective Renata Alvarez of the Financial Crimes Unit, 17 years on the force, the last 9 spent almost exclusively on embezzlement and related party fraud cases involving handling closely held businesses. Alvarez didn't open a criminal file yet. There wasn't enough for that, not officially, not without more, but she agreed to consult informally, off the books of any formal complaint, reviewing what Priya and Marcus had assembled, and telling us bluntly whether it was the kind of pattern that eventually became a criminal referral or the kind that stayed a civil dispute between businesses. This is structuring, she told Daniel in a call I wasn't supposed to be on, but was, quietly, in the next room. Someone kept the payments small enough and frequent enough to stay under any single threshold that would have triggered automatic review. That's not sloppy bookkeeping. That's a plan. I stood in my kitchen, and I did not make a sound. The crisis peak arrived 9 days before the gala, and it arrived the way these things always seem to. Not as a single dramatic blow, but as 3 separate, ordinary-looking emails landing within an hour of each other, each one quietly detonating a different part of the ground I was standing on. The first was from the acquisition group's lead counsel, informing Daniel's team that Hawthorne Advisory's closing date had been moved up, not delayed, accelerated. The buyers wanted to finalize before their own fiscal quarter closed, which meant the ethics review window had just been cut from 3 weeks to 4 days. The second was from Priya. Marcus had found a 5th manufactured invoice, and this one had a detail the others hadn't. A login timestamp buried in the shared drive's access logs, showing exactly whose credentials had created and backdated the document. Not Ryan's, Claire's. She'd apparently been given limited administrative access to the firm's shared drive months earlier. The kind of access a company gives a trusted family associate without thinking too hard about what it means to hand someone a key to your books. The third email was from my mother. She'd found out somehow. I never did learn exactly how, though I've since accepted that my mother finding things out has never required much explanation. That I was involved with the acquisition group, evaluating Hawthorne Advisory. Her message was 3 lines long. I heard you're mixed up in Ryan's business dealings somehow. I hope you're not doing anything vindictive, Emily. It's been 6 years. Surely you can be the bigger person. I had 24 hours to decide whether to attend the gala at all. If I didn't come, the ethics review would still proceed exactly as scheduled. Daniel's team, Priya, Marcus, and now Detective Alvarez consulting formally, would present their findings to the acquisition group regardless of whether I was in the building. My presence changed nothing about the mechanics of what was about to happen, but if I didn't come, I would spend the rest of my life wondering whether I'd hidden from that ballroom the same way I'd once fled a plane with my number changed before it landed. And some brittle, stubborn part of me, the part that had built an auditable donor platform specifically so nobody would ever again have to take anything on blind trust, needed to be standing in the room when the truth finally became undeniable to everyone in it. My hands wouldn't stop shaking the morning of the gala. Not from fear, exactly. From the specific electric exhaustion of 6 years finally arriving somewhere. Daniel found me in the kitchen at 6 a.m., already dressed for a day that wouldn't start for 12 more hours, staring at nothing. He didn't ask if I was okay. He asked, do you want me to hold the review until after the closing dinners, or do it tonight in the room? It was, I understood, entirely my call. Not because Daniel needed permission. The findings existed independent of me, but because he was asking whether I wanted to witness it, or whether I needed him to spare me from watching. Tonight, I said. In the room. Daniel opened the folder fully now, right there under the chandelier, in front of Claire, in front of my mother, in front of the small cluster of reporters from 3 business magazines who had drifted with a particular gravitational pull journalists have for a raised voice close enough to hear. The first line named the account Carter Family Consulting. The second line named who had opened it, who had signed every withdrawal request, and who had been quietly moving client funds through it for the better part of a year. Not Ryan. Claire. I watched my sister's face do something I'd never once seen it do in 32 years of watching it. Go completely, utterly still, the practiced ease draining out of her features in real time like water finding a drain. That's not. Claire started and stopped because there was nowhere the sentence could go that wouldn't make things worse. Ms. Carter, Daniel said, not unkindly, in the flat procedural voice I recognized from every ethics review he'd ever walked me through at our own kitchen table. Our forensic examiner identified 4 invoices generated retroactively, all created within a 48-hour window using credentials registered to your name. Detective Alvarez has reviewed the pattern and characterized it in a preliminary consultation as consistent with structured embezzlement, payments deliberately kept below thresholds that would trigger standard review. Detective, Ryan repeated, and I watched the word land on him harder than it had landed on Claire, because Ryan, for all his faults, had never quite understood that ignorance of a crime committed under your own roof, on your own books, using your own firm's shared drive, is not the same thing as innocence of it. Wait, I didn't know anything about this. I never, Claire, tell them you didn't. I was helping, Claire said, and her voice had gone small and fast in a way I remembered from childhood, from every time she'd broken something of mine and needed, immediately, for the story to become about her intentions rather than the object in pieces on the floor. The company needed cash flow, Ryan was drowning, and I moved things around so it would look better for the investors, that's all. I was trying to help you. You embezzled $481,000 from Hawthorne Advisory's operating account over 14 months, Priya said. She'd stepped forward without my noticing, folder of her own in hand, because of course she had. Priya had spent 14 years learning exactly when a room needed someone to say the number out loud instead of letting a euphemism absorb it. That's not moving things around. That's the finding. My mother, to her credit or to her detriment, I still haven't decided which, did not try to defend Claire. She turned instead toward me, and for one unguarded second, I saw something on her face I'd waited 32 years to see and had stopped somewhere around year 4 in Denver, expecting every never to see again. Emily, she said, did you do this? Did you bring us here to— I recused myself from this review the day I found Claire's name on the filing. I said, I'm not the one who signed 41 checks to a company with no deliverables. I'm not the one who backdated 4 invoices 3 weeks before a closing deadline. I didn't do this, Mom. I just built the kind of system where it couldn't stay hidden. It wasn't the mic drop line I'd have written for this moment if I'd let myself imagine it in advance, back when I was still someone who imagined confrontations that never came. It was truer than that, quieter, and it landed harder in the room for being neither. The consequences arrived exactly as fast as consequences arrive once an acquisition group's own legal counsel has watched an embezzlement finding presented in front of 3 business journalists. The deal collapsed within the week, not the acquisition itself, which the buyers still wanted, but the terms. Hawthorne Advisory's valuation was slashed by the exact figure Priya had documented, plus the cost of an independent audit the buyers now insisted on before closing at all. Ryan kept the firm technically, but kept it smaller, poorer, and under a level of financial scrutiny that would follow every disbursement for the next 3 years, per the amended terms Daniel's team negotiated. Claire was charged 11 weeks later. Detective Alvarez's informal consultation became a formal referral the moment Marcus's authenticated document trail crossed her desk with an actual complainant attached. Hawthorne Advisory's board, not me, filed it, which mattered to me more than I expected it to. I never once had to be the one holding the pen. Claire pleaded to a reduced embezzlement charge 8 months later. Restitution ordered at the full $481,000, a sentence of 18 months with the possibility of parole at 12. Ryan filed for divorce from Claire. They'd married quietly 2 years after that morning in my mother's living room, a fact I only learned that night, 4 months after the charges were announced. I don't know what happened to him after that. I stopped tracking it. Some part of me expected wanting to know forever, and I was almost disappointed, in a way I still can't fully explain, at how quickly the wanting simply stopped. My mother called me twice in the following year. I answered once. I let it go to voicemail the second time, and I haven't decided yet whether I ever will call back. Some doors you close because you're angry. Others you close because you finally stopped needing them open. A year later, almost to the day, Meridian hosted its next gala. Smaller this time. No acquisition groups, no crisis, no folder opened under a chandelier. Just 400 nonprofits and the quiet, unglamorous business of moving money toward people who needed it, exactly the way it was supposed to move. Daniel found me by the terrace doors near the end of the night. 2 glasses of the same terrible coffee we'd started this whole thing on, because he thinks it's funny now. In a way, I've decided to let him keep thinking. You okay? He asked. Not, are you happy? Which I've noticed he never asks, because he says happiness is a mood, and he's more interested in whether the foundation under it holds. I built a life they can't touch, I said. That's not the same as okay, but it's close enough to call it something. He didn't try to improve on that. He just handed me the coffee and let the quiet do the rest, the way he always does, the way I'd once have called unimaginable, standing in a doorway with a box of invitations that never got mailed, watching my mother hand my whole future to someone else like it had never once belonged to me at all. It belonged to me the entire time. It just took the truth a little while to catch up.